Alcohol is part of the celebration of life. We toast the new year, old friends, and good health. It is such an accepted part of our culture, we tend to forget that alcohol is a mood-altering drug. A little can make you feel good, but a lot can make you feel bad. Society pays an enormous price for those bad times. The largest drug enforcement problem in the United States today is alcohol abuse. Drunk drivers kill more than 25,000 people each year. Most violent assaults and at least half our murders occur during bouts of intoxication. And family violence is often linked to alcohol.
Why'd you hit her, man?
He goes out, he's been drinking, and he came home, and then he hit my mother. When he's not drinking, I have no problems at all. Everybody gets along with him. But when he's drinking, everybody's afraid of him.
90% of physical assaults, 50% of murders, and 25% of suicides are alcohol-related. But the really frightening fact is, alcoholism can happen to anyone.
My country came first. I was born of that generation. My family came second. I loved each and every one of my children. I loved the Navy. I had risen through the ranks. I loved those things. They were deep values that were ingrained in us, and yet I did give every single one of them up for a drink in the end.
Tony Flaherty is a 25-year veteran of the Navy and a 39-year veteran of alcoholism. Now sober for more than 8 years, he began his drinking when he was just 14.
Alcohol permitted me to do things. I was very shy, very introspective. I was very small. Alcohol made me 8 feet tall.
A bright student, Tony graduated from high school when he was 16, and soon after joined the Navy.
So I went in the Navy, where in my eyes, you were supposed to work hard and play hard. However, there was always trouble. When we went ashore, I was the one arrested by the shore patrol. I married a beautiful girl. But from the outset, there was trouble again with alcohol. It could be stated that the only trouble in the home was alcohol. But of course, very early on, being an alcoholic, I blamed people, places, and things, and it was convenient to blame her. Then I had a son, and I quit for the son, but that didn't last long either. I had a couple more children. All the time I'm progressing in the Navy. Clever enough to get, to be very adept at my work, but also to get with people who maybe just drank a little like me also. I could always search them out in the clubs, the club atmosphere, and the hail and farewell. I had everything to live for, but I was at this time now a periodic drunk. And the periods were sometimes farther apart, but then they were coming closer and closer together. Initially, it was the weekends from Friday to Sunday. Now the weekends maybe start on Thursday night and go to Monday afternoon. Okay. There were many embarrassing situations, many arrests, many heavy injuries to my body. But those didn't seem to be the worst agony. Was the internal failure, the guaranteed failure. I knew there was something wrong, but I did not know what it was. That unknown fear always over your shoulder, always a certainty, always a drink. The drink led to disaster. It was a constant compulsion, never ending.
The mystery about alcoholism is most people drink, but only a limited number, about 1 in 10, develop severe drinking problems. The question that challenges society is what distinguishes the person who becomes alcoholic from the rest who don't. We will reveal how science is beginning to answer that question. We'll follow the medical detective story that underlies the research into an affliction called America's #1 health problem. The door was opened to scientific inquiry in 1966 when the American Medical Association recognized alcoholism as a disease. The pace quickened 5 years later when the federal government created the National Institute for Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse. In less than a decade, researchers have uncovered surprising data about how alcohol affects the human body and who is at risk to develop the disease. Investigators have learned that early symptoms can be very subtle and diagnosis elusive. Today, medical writers have detailed the progression of symptoms that physician Sheila Bloom has seen in thousands of alcoholic patients.
The typical alcoholic person, if there can be said to be one, because it happens to so many different people, finds alcohol at first his or her best friend. It does things for that person that he or she cannot do alone. It's a hard relationship to explain to people who haven't experienced it themselves.
Oh, we're gonna fold it after?
We don't think of suburban picnics, family living, or smiling faces.
The spot's even on the table.
Yet Ernie Dignan is an alcoholic. For 23 years, Ernie's life was clouded by an all-consuming relationship with alcohol.
I think I have.
Alcohol for me is not what it is to the social drinker. If you said, come on over for a drink, I'd say, a drink? Wouldn't bother. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand one drink. I don't understand somebody who can take a drink, drink 2/3 of it, and leave the rest.
Until 4 years ago, when he stopped drinking, alcoholism twisted and distorted all that had been normal in Ernie's life.
When I got with what was normal, happy, healthy, family-type things, I always felt uncomfortable. I hated family holidays, hated to see them coming. I was always depressed during that period because I didn't feel a part of it. I didn't feel normal.
But now, well on his way to recovery, Ernie can see the ways in which alcohol made the abnormal seem normal.
What do you want, Joe?
I once had a bartender friend that I talked with. You know, I said, gee, I felt like I drank an awful lot yesterday.
I ate it with a Rohan.
Yeah? And he said, well, you did pretty good. You drank 13 of these tumblers full of martinis, and we measured those tumblers to find out, and they were triple martinis. And I consumed 13 of them, and I remember driving home that night.
Some of the early symptoms of alcoholism have to do with increasing alcohol intake. So they're gulping drinks, they're drinking before the party to make sure you have enough. They're drinking on the sly, kidding yourself and kidding other people around you. Some of the physiological symptoms that start early are what we call blackouts. Now, that doesn't mean passing out. It means memory loss.
I didn't drink every day, but when I drank to excess. I'm what they call a periodic drinker or a binge drinker. I would go on toots. I would sometimes disappear for a few days. And all I would have done is drinking, and don't ask me where I was or what I did. And usually when I came to, I had no idea where I was. Completely strange place or town or something, or another side of the same town, and not even know how I got there, what bars I'd been in. Very, very scary situation to wake up and not know which way to turn on the street to find my way home.
Then slowly over time, a loss of control develops. That means that although sometimes the individual can plan the day and how much that person will drink, other times they may decide that they have to stop drinking in order to do something else, and then find that they've continued drinking and the other agenda has been dropped. They cannot predict, certainly, when they sit down to drink at a particular time, how and when it will end.
During the 17th century, alcohol was thought to have medicinal values. It was a popular substitute for water, which was considered unsafe. Even though drinking was accepted, drunkenness was not. Puritan New England believed drunkards were sinners who should be put in stocks or even whipped. But in 1785, Benjamin Rush, a medical pioneer, wrote that alcoholism was a disease. Drunkards were seen as the victims of alcohol, not of their own weak character. By the early 1900s, the idea had caught on. The temperance movement became a major force in the United States. Alcohol was seen as evil and needed to be stamped out to cure society's ills. In 1920, the Prohibition Amendment was passed, making alcohol illegal in the United States. The pendulum had swung from seeing the drunkard as bad to seeing drink as bad. But it was the Roaring '20s. And law or no law, some people wanted to drink. And drink they did. Speakeasies and bootleggers flourished, and the law proved impossible to enforce. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, however, continued its campaign to keep Americans away from alcohol. But in 1933, one of the first acts of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was to sign the repeal of prohibition, ending the noble experiment. The pendulum had swung back. The problem wasn't alcohol. The problem was the alcoholic. Normal drinkers were seen as happy, stable people, so clearly alcoholics must be depressed, unstable individuals. This idea was reinforced by researchers who studied alcoholics, relying on the hazy recollections of those already afflicted with the disorder. This technique was to be proven flawed.
George, I think that this is the one that has the exact date that we're looking for.
An important breakthrough was made by Dr. George Valiant and his colleagues when they completed a monumental study with an important twist. 600 adolescents were selected before any drinking problems were present. For 30 years, the subjects were tracked in a series of interviews.
Certainly on him, I mean, I think I could even call him up.
Sure.
The researchers followed the lives of the men, hoping to identify those traits that led to the development of alcoholism.
Mrs. Jones, my name is Eva Malofsky. I work for Harvard Medical School. I'm trying to get in touch with your son, and I wonder if you might...
Their efforts were rewarded by unexpected results.
He's moved to Chicago. Do you have the
When
address?
I began my study, I found that a great many people who were depressed and anxious also had alcoholism. But as soon as I looked at the men's lives before they developed alcoholism, I found, to my surprise, that there was no way that they could be distinguished from the non-alcoholics. And I was chagrined as I continued this study to realize that my assumptions were wrong and that alcohol abuse doesn't help anybody cope, but in fact it causes the problems and the apparent mental instability. And therefore alcoholics are depressed because they drink. They don't drink because they're depressed. But when one looked at the childhoods of the men with alcoholism and the men without alcoholism, one found only one enormous difference. Many of the men who developed alcoholism had alcoholic parents.
Did children learn to be alcoholic from the role model of their parents? Or could there be a genetic basis for alcoholism? To answer the question, scientists had to find a way to separate learned or environmental factors from ones that were inherited. Working on this problem was Dr. Donald Goodwin.
One way that you can separate environment from hereditary factors in things that run in families, like alcoholism, is that you can study twins. And twins come in two types. Identical twins are genetically identical. Fraternal twins just happen to be brothers who were born at the same time. Now, if you have something that is 100% genetic or inherited, both identical twins are going to have it. And in the case of alcoholism, we do indeed find that with identical twins, if one twin is alcoholic, the other twin is alcoholic a high proportion of the time. And this you do not find with fraternal twins. So this is evidence that alcoholism is influenced by genetic factors. Another way you could study something that runs in families where you don't know whether it's learned or whether it's inherited or whether it's both, is that you can study people who were separated from their biological parents and were adopted out and were raised by adoptive families. And that happens with a lot of people, of course. There's a good deal of opportunity to do adoption studies, and we conducted one in Denmark a few years ago, the first in recent times, looking at the children of alcoholics. Now, we went out and found them as adults after they'd had a chance to be exposed to drinking, and we found that the sons of alcoholics who had been adopted away, who had no exposure to their parents, their real parents, were still alcoholic at a very high rate.
In fact, Dr. Goodwin's research found that the sons of alcoholics had 3 times greater risk of developing alcoholism than the sons of non-alcoholics. But his study was based on just 133 subjects. Would the pattern hold up in a larger population? Conducting such a study was Dr. Robert Cloninger.
The Stockholm adoption study includes all the children who were born out of wedlock in Stockholm, Sweden from 1917 to 1949. This is a total of about 3,000 adoptees, both men and women, who were separated from their biological parents at an early age and then placed in homes of non-relatives. We had far and away the greatest amount of information that had been assembled.
In studying thousands of adoptees, Dr. Cloninger found that the biological sons and daughters of alcoholic parents had between 2 and 2.5 times the risk of developing alcoholism when compared to the children of non-alcoholic parents. The implications of this second study were clear.
Our study confirmed earlier work by Don Goodwin that, in fact, genetic factors were very important in the transmission of alcoholism.
When environment was separated from genetics, the evidence was clear. Before we sip our first drink, we've inherited genes that may influence our risk for alcoholism. The question then emerged, what is it we inherit?
Take a look up.
The search for clues has begun in the maze of genetics. An intriguing possibility was recently uncovered, less by design than serendipity. Dr. Henry Begleiter had been studying the effects of alcohol on the brain.
In looking at long-term effects of alcohol in the brain of alcoholics, we have observed a number of deficits in various parts of the brain.
Using the latest X-ray techniques, scientists can examine interior views of the human brain. A normal, healthy brain is surrounded by a light color border of bone. The brain matter itself appears as light gray tissue dappled by small dark spots of fluid that cushion the brain matter. However, in a chronic alcoholic, the brain shows dramatic physical changes. Large dark pockets of fluid are now visible where the brain tissue is actually shrunken after repeated high exposure to alcohol. Using a variety of techniques, studies have shown that many of the adverse effects of alcohol in the brain are reversed when a subject stops drinking.
This is definitely a typical pattern that we see in alcoholic patients.
But Dr. Begleiter noticed that one area, known as the P3 component, the component that deals with memory and emotion, did not recover.
Brain shrinkage. We began to consider the possibility that some of these deficits, in fact, were not the consequences of chronic alcohol abuse, but in light of the findings of a possible genetic transmission of alcoholism, we became quite excited about the possibility that these, in fact, findings represented some deficits which anteceded, that is, which were present before the development of alcoholism.
To test his theory that a brain deficit might exist in the P3 component before the development of alcoholism, Dr. Begleiter began to study children before they were exposed to alcohol. 2 groups were selected. The first group from non-alcoholic parents.
We'll begin now.
The second, a high-risk group, sons of alcoholic fathers. The researchers measured brain activity in the brain's P3 component. The child was shown a stimulus, in this case a flash of light, while sophisticated equipment recorded the response of specific areas in the brain. Did the sons of alcoholics show a deficit in the P3 component? After analyzing the results from the test, Dr. Begleiter found that 30 to 40% of the high-risk boys had abnormal brainwave patterns with depressed P3 components.
There's a tremendous difference here.
Yes.
Particularly for the targets. An enormous difference here.
The major differences in the P3.
Yes.
Since it is thought about 30% of the sons of alcoholics go on to develop alcoholism, Dr. Begleiter's findings had intriguing implications.
Particularly in the last two panels, I see
The
a big,
targets,
a
yeah.
large P3 difference.
Yeah.
Could this brainwave abnormality be a predisposing factor for alcoholism?
Yes.
With the other subjects, quite consistent. The results look very good. When we first saw the data, we were quite excited about the possibility, and at this point it is no more than a mere possibility, that we were in fact possibly looking at a predisposing factor. And we will not know this until we are able to follow these boys every year for several years and determine who goes on to abuse alcohol and who doesn't. See you again in 1 year. Okay, bye, David.
The search has just begun to uncover what we might inherit to predispose us to alcoholism. But for those already afflicted, treatment is available today.
We're going to be talking to
Dr. Margaret Bean has served as the career teacher in substance abuse for the Harvard Medical School. She knows the alcoholic patient faces many obstacles on the road to recovery.
Most people have a stereotype of what an alcoholic is, and they think it's bad. They don't think Betty Ford and Winston Churchill. They think Skid Row, panhandling in the weeds for Muscatel, dying of liver disease, lousy outcome.
To help break that stereotype, Dr. Bean introduces medical students at the Cambridge Hospital to patients recovering from alcoholism.
I'm Dr. Bean.
Their questions focus on the difficulties in diagnosing alcoholism.
If you were to have showed up in an emergency room with your fatigue or depression, how would you have looked to the students here? Would they have realized that you had alcoholism, or would it have been difficult?
I think it would have been difficult unless I was actually loaded with alcohol at the time, you might know, but otherwise I certainly would not have given you any information. I did seek doctors' help, and they did give me sleeping pills and things and told me that it was okay to drink on top of the wine. Of course, I didn't tell them how much I drank either. So no, I don't think it would have been. My complaint would not have been drinking. It would have been, I have a stomachache or a headache or I can't sleep or whatever.
Did anyone ever ask you about alcoholism?
If you had been asked how much you drank, would you have told them how much, or would you have lied about it or cut the amount down?
I might have. Yeah, I would just say I drank wine, or I might have really thought that I drank 2 glasses of wine. If the glasses were iced tea tumblers, I probably wouldn't have told you that.
So you really didn't have any idea what was happening to you?
No, absolutely not. I thought it was because I was a single mother and I had to work too hard and there were just too many problems. I couldn't cope with it.
Denial and false stereotypes often confound both doctor and patient, making it difficult to identify the alcoholic. Unlike many other diseases, there's no one simple diagnostic procedure. Blood tests often help physicians seeking to identify disease, but with alcoholism, no single test has proven accurate 100% of the time. Computer technology, however, may open new doors in the search for a test for alcoholism. At the National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, Dr. Ralph Ryback and his colleagues have developed a unique way of analyzing the results from standard blood chemistry tests obtained during routine physicals.
The chemistry is already there, the physician has them available, but it's very difficult for a physician to juggle more than 2, 3, or 4, or 5 values in his mind at one time. And that's not just a physician's mind, that's anybody's mind. And if we looked at the chemistries with a computer, we could derive more meaning.
Automated blood analyzers like this one are now widely used in the medical community. More than 25 different blood chemistry measurements can be calculated in a series of mechanized tests. Normally, the results arrive on a physician's desk as a printout of numbers, but with Dr. Ryback's technique, the test values are fed into a computer for analysis. The data creates a pattern from the patient's blood test which can be compared to the pattern of known alcoholics.
This is in the direction of a biochemical definition of alcoholism, or the fact that alcohol causes an altered physiologic state that would otherwise not be there.
The computer uses a technique similar to fingerprint identification. Each blood chemistry measurement is like a single line on a fingerprint. No one line identifies a person with complete accuracy, but the pattern created by the lines allows for positive identification. A normal patient's blood test might be visualized like this, but a patient who regularly consumes more than 4 to 6 drinks per day would reflect a different pattern. By comparing a patient's blood test results against those of known alcoholics, the computer can provide the physician with objective information about the drinking habits of the patient. Even if a heavy drinker abstained for several days before the test, the physiological shift is persistent and would be visible to the computer.
Accordingly, a test or an approach that would allow earlier identification perhaps would make it easier for the physician to intervene, since he would no longer be suggesting that it's some sort of a subjective judgment or some type of a personal recrimination or derogatory remark, quote, "You are an alcoholic," with all the stigmata that our society has assigned to that comment. Rather, the physician could say, "John Doe, I've known you for a number of years. Your blood chemistries and their interrelationships appear similar to those individuals who have received a medical diagnosis of alcoholism. I feel that we need to investigate this further. Can we discuss this?" With that type of an approach, many patients would find it much easier, particularly if this was done in a routine, matter-of-fact way.